Hello, my name is Jopanda. I'm a third year PhD student in cultural studies at UC Davis. I'm also serving as the associate director and one of the co-founders for the Bulasan Center for Filipino Studies here at UC Davis as well. And my collaborative project is called Illustrated Lesson Plans for Liberation, a multimedia project documenting the journey of Filipino trafficked teachers in the US. And I am honored and proud to be in collaboration with some amazing folks on this project, including GABRIELA D.C, the D.C. chapter of GABRIELA USA and GABRIELA International, Filipina Militant Women's Rights Organization, as well as Migrante D.C, Filipino, Filipina, Filipinex, Migrant Rights Organization, and the D.C. chapter of Migrante International, as well as some amazing activists, anti-labor trafficking organizers, educators in their own right, Noel Abalos and Faye Kapili. I'm also, of course, honored to work with the amazing Angel Traso, an awesome archivist, organizer, scholar activist who lended her craft and her talents in illustration to be able to depict, share, narrate, and document some of the interviews and some of the stories shared to us by Noel and Faye. So within this project, a community-centered, community-engaged research project and multimedia project, Illustrated Lessons for Liberation centers on the narratives of Filipino, Filipina, Filipinx identified labor trafficked teachers from the Philippines to the United States. I want to really start off by talking and speaking about my project and my experience through this project as being stemming from my own lived experiences as an immigrant myself, a child of immigrants, and particularly one that has grown up through the diaspora. Being from a transnational family, I lived multiple years, whether it be with just my dad in the United States, my mom in Canada, or with my grandparents, my lola, my lola, in the Philippines, Iloilo, Philippines. And through that experience, it's really shaped my own perspective and my own passion for studying the Filipinx diaspora and understanding and better recognizing and learning about the different narratives that we share and the unique narratives that we have around migration and particularly migrant labor, given my parents' experiences as overseas foreign workers. Again, I want to really reiterate the amazing collaboration I've had previous to this project with Gabriela USA, a militant Filipino women's rights organization. Pictured here, I had the privilege of visiting and working with and learning from different US based chapters of Gabriela. Specifically, the Gabriela D.C., Washington, D.C. chapter has been amazing in terms of their mentoring of myself since 2012, 2013, connecting me to amazing individuals within the organization who have experienced labor trafficking as Filipino teachers, are now speaking out against not just labor trafficking, but the continued exploitation of Filipino, Filipina, Filipinx migrant workers. I also had the privilege of interviewing some of the trafficked teachers, not just based in DC, but also based in Seattle as well as in the Bay Area, and being able to connect build community with the Seattle, New York, and San Francisco based chapters of Gabriela. Through some of these interviews I held back in 2013 through my undergraduate research fellowship, I was able to recognize and think about and connect with the teachers and learn about their motivations to leave. Fatima, based out of DC, stated, "I told them that if you were to compare the salary from dollar to peso, it was already enough to help my family finance their studies. My salary in the Philippines was only $500 per month." Through very similar representations or very similar sharings from the teachers who I interviewed, we saw that there's a connection between their need to leave the Philippines to find work as a teacher elsewhere and the Philippines labor export system and practice. The labor export policy in the 1970s set up systems and institutions to educate, train, and commodify really Filipino bodies as bodies of labor abroad, distinctly stating and sharing and showcasing them as the premier, the best overseas worker for the global economy. Other teachers, when asked about their experience coming to the United States, having first being unfortunately trafficked to the United States by their illegal recruitment agency, Naomi in California stated, "I keep everything to myself. Nobody knows what I'm suffering. Sometimes I go out and I want to go crazy all the time. I cannot sleep for even 2 hours." Talking about mental health and speaking about these experiences openly, these teachers share about the mental and emotional toll of the process, having been trained, forced to perform as quote unquote obedient, silent, and submissive migrant workers, migrant teachers, even during moments of uncertainty and peril when they arrive in the United States. When they're told that the promised jobs as full time teachers were not available anymore because of the quote unquote bad economy, when they're forced into housing situations, living with 10 to 15 other migrant teachers who were also trafficked, when they were threatened with legal, with physical ramifications if they were to speak out about their situation to their loved ones in the Philippines after having arrived in the US. They felt trapped. They felt forced to stay silent. And this continues the effects of the long history of U.S. and Western colonial education in the Philippines and how our peoples, the Filipino peoples, have been racialized as obedient, silent, and submissive, as malleable subjects for the U.S. Philippines project. From this initial project back in 2013 and built through the past 5 or so years, uh, we look at these major claims: coloniality and labor brokering, connecting the Philippines' labor brokering policies, the way that they engage, the way that they commodify their citizens as overseas Filipino foreign workers, as connected to this long history of U.S. imperialism in the Philippines. We also look at these connections that lead to the rise in Filipino labor trafficking. The more migrant workers that are approved to head abroad, the more opportunities there are for recruitment agencies like the one centered here today to traffic Filipino workers abroad, not just teachers, but different types of workers from different distinct fields. We talk about breaking the narratives, understanding that these cases help shape and share that there's not one specific type of narrative when it comes to trafficking about who is trafficked, right? We look at many of these teachers, many who are educated, many women and men who also obtained their masters in education, some even their PhD, having been enticed by this recruitment agency and told about these opportunities to work abroad in the US to teach fully and to be able to send more money back to their family members in the Philippines, and having these narratives break this kind of assumption of who is trafficked and who does the trafficking. This forces a new view on not just immigration reform, but around trafficking protection and migrant labor protections as well. And lastly, and most importantly in my mind, is looking at organizations like Gabriela as a disruptor of coloniality, not just providing survivors with political education resources, but the survivors of trafficking themselves taking up leadership roles in organizations like Gabriela, like Migrante, and taking on the roles of not just supporting themselves and finding opportunities for self empowerment, whether it be through obtaining their trafficking T visa so they can work legally, quote unquote, legally in the United States, or being able to reunify with their family members in the US, but also serving and supporting other survivors of trafficking, those who came through similar routes, providing educational workshops, providing legal workshops and support in regards to folks who need to apply for the T visa themselves, and also demonstrating and holding rallies outside the Philippines. Outside the Philippines embassy in Washington, D.C., demanding further justice, not just for the trafficked teachers, but for all those impacted by forced labor migration and the lack of migrant labor protections throughout the Philippines diaspora. So ultimately, does this lead us? It leads us to our current project, Illustrate Lessons Plans for Liberation. Through 6+ years of learning from organizing, but really just being a mentee and learning from the teachers themselves from organizations like Gabriela D.C. and Migrante D.C. in Washington, D.C. I'm able to really better understand it and recognize these patterns of forced labor migration. But more importantly, being in community with the teachers themselves and with the organizers seeing this beautiful process of them sharing their process of identifying as trafficking victims to then survivors of trafficking, and ultimately now for many of them, organizers and anti-trafficking activists, leading the way as leaders, part of both Migrante or Gabriela D.C. in their own right. And that's what this project in itself is about, is disrupting coloniality, self-organizing, self-advocacy through the visuals that Angel Trasso, myself, and the two interviewees, Faye and Noel, share today, is looking at their journeys as not journeys of calling to not just journeys of calling for action and for its protections, but journeys of empowerment as well. Right. Evie from Spokane shares, I think what motivated me to come out was the support I got from Gabriela. It's because of the support coming from the outside who empathize with you, understands you, has the same goal as you. Evie shares about the emphasis that they've made around their cases, right? Around their ability to organize as a community. And through Gabriela D.C., Migrante D.C., the different chapters I've engaged with that have served and supported traffic teachers in themselves, they don't denounce this new colonial conditioning and tools and stereotypes used to force upon the teachers, the migrant workers overall. Borrowing and challenging from the rich history of Filipino labor organizing, they claim a space for themselves. Majority of the teachers themselves identifying it as femme, as women and organizers and teachers in their own right, they recognize that there's a lack of history on female Filipina identified labor organizing, and they are adding to that chapter and and making sure folks recognize that labor organizing is also a space for Filipinas and not just Filipinos in the United States. And lastly, like I mentioned earlier, reclaiming an identity as survivors, as political activists. These teachers are not just educators now, they are organizers. They not just empower themselves and their families and continue to fight for the justice for their trafficking cases, but they continue to fight against forced migration, labor exploitation of the Filipino peoples all throughout our diaspora. And that's one of the most powerful impacts of their experiences and of their journeys. So we see them celebrating their victories, warning situations in which their members may be in stress, but ultimately moving as a community together, whether it be celebrating their members receiving their trafficking visas, like you see here in this picture, in these pictures, or organizing outside of the Philippines DC embassy, demanding more attention to be paid towards Filipino migrant workers and their lack of protections abroad, many of who have experienced violence, wage theft, trafficking, amongst different issues that our migrant workers have experienced altogether. They move as a community and they organize as a community. And from trafficking victims to survivors to organizers, they continue to organize and move as a community to this day. So the 2020 Mellon Public Scholars Project, coming out of this long collaborative project I've had with Gabriela D.C., Migrante D.C., and the many traffic teachers turned anti-trafficking organizers I've worked with since 2013, 2012. This project in itself came from conversations with Bay Area-based Filipinx teacher organizers, those who themselves were trafficked. They shared that they had a desire to share their story and provide a tool or some type of media for those who may find themselves in similar experiences having been trafficked. They also saw and sought creative outlets to share, their story and their journey with various audience members, including their own students and children. Many of those who were interviewed in the past and those who are interviewed now share about how they want to share their journey as trafficking survivors, as organizers with their students, with their fellow faculty or fellow coworkers and community. So through these conversations, we want to provide more access and accessible modes of talking about labor trafficking and ways to initiate this conversation to further protect those who may be vulnerable to trafficking, not just from the Philippines, but from different countries abroad who tap into migrant teacher work as well. So the timeline, I was able to have initial meetings with Angel Trasso, our archivist in collaboration, the teachers involved in the interviewing, and of course myself to confirm timelines expectations, the schedule of interviews. We interviewed the teachers between July, August, and again a little bit in September to clarify not just a project, but in itself and the goals for the project, but also just having talk story kwentuhan, what we call kwentuhan sessions, to just have the teachers share their stories with myself and Angel. I've worked with the two interviewees in the past, back in 2013, but it was a delight to reconnect with them, to hear how their story has evolved, how their journey has evolved, and to connect them with Angel, who during that time began her process of illustrating parts of their narratives and their stories. In August, Angel, myself, and the selected teachers would check in throughout on the progress of the project, on the draft, September through November. The development of the comic strip, quote unquote, or illustration took place. And before completion, we were able to ensure the teachers approve of the representation and final outcome of the work. Furthermore, we present the project in itself, and you'll see a link to the project once it's fully complete on this page for Mellon, for the Mellon Public Scholars program, as well as through the Bulusan Center for Filipino Studies, lesson plans for justice, narratives of Filipino trafficked teachers in the U.S. Again, it's been an amazing process collaborating with Angel, with Faye Capili and Noel Abalos, who are illustrated below, and being able to see the work that Angel does as an amazing scholar, activist, and artivist. We see that connection to the teacher stories as well. So just some information around Angel and the amazing work he does. And here are some of the pages from the illustration project in itself. Not just sharing the narratives that the teachers were willing to share with us, but looking at the themes of forced migration, themes of family separation, themes of and images and feelings of how labor trafficking of teachers operated for themselves and for many of their colleagues. Right. So last reflections through quarantine and the challenges we faced, we were able to find a storytelling method, a mode of healing and community building through this project in itself. The interviewees shared their excitements and not just sharing their stories to their children and their students through visual arts, but they spoke about this experience being cathartic, being a healing process. Before this project, since we first had our interviews back in 2013 and how that's evolved through the project's timeline, they've shared about how, just sharing their stories, talk story, kwentuhans, with their community members, whether it be myself or with other teachers, has been a mode of healing for and empowerment for them, a process of reflection that they don't take for granted and that they continue to do with those around them. We analyze their experiences through a racial capitalist lens. The Philippines' cultural labor migration shapes the environment for overseas Filipino foreign workers to be taken advantage of by illegal recruitment agencies, like the illegal recruitment agency headed by Isidro Rodriguez, who took advantage of many of the trafficked teachers. And we look at how Filipino bodies are commodified as cheap, reliable, malleable bodies of disposable migrant labor, which of course is very problematic and stems from continued effects from the history of US imperialism, colonialism in the Philippines. So the teachers themselves, as organizers, as anti-trafficking organizers, continue to combat this, call this out, call out the Philippines government to provide further protections for their workers abroad, make sure their voices aren't silenced by their employers abroad. This continued calls for further protection to overseas workers, but also dismantling the system of forced migrant labor, as expansive an idea as that might be, and recognizing the violent impact of neoliberal global labor policies in the Philippines. Why are there so many Filipino families that need to leave the Philippines to work abroad? There's a lack of protections. There's a lack of resources in the homeland, and therefore some of them feel it's a need to be able to work abroad and send money back to the Philippines rather than a choice. And lastly, the importance of community-engaged scholarship. This project in itself, it is creative works and its collaboration with the teachers in its roots is community-based. It's a community-engaged scholarship, a community-centered or project, and one that centers on the amazing work of the two interviewees, as organizers and the amazing organizations that I've been proud to be in collaboration with since 2013, GABRIELA D.C. and Migrante D.C. and their respective chapters. We honor the stories shared through this project. We honor Faye and Noel, um, and encourage in speaking out against trafficking, not just their cases, but the systems that allow for labor trafficking to take place in the Philippines. And we honor the many teachers that are continuing to seek justice for their cases and for the collective liberation as trafficking survivors. So with that said, I thank you. We thank you for this amazing opportunity to collaborate. Feel free to reach out to me at wejopanda@ucdavis.edu if you have any questions around this project, want to learn more, or want to learn how to connect to the amazing organizations such as Gabriela DC, Migrante DC, and the awesome teachers that continue to fight towards collective liberation today. I thank you for this opportunity. I thank the Bulacan Center for Filipinic Studies for housing our project and the Mellon Public Scholars Project for this opportunity in itself. So thank you so much. We appreciate the opportunity to collaborate, and we look forward to continue building community and collaboration with you all in the future.